All right,
Let's do
back
this again.
again.
Yeah.
A warning to anybody who actually watches these in order. 2 or 3 episodes ago, when it was just us before our recent guests, we were like, at the end, we were like, we need to pick this up next time. We're not. At least not right now. We might come back to it, but if you hit start on this, hoping we were going to pick right up from the end of that conversation about catharsis versus impact versus whatever,
Right.
we can talk about absurdism and futility and how you define impact in the future. But Kyle has a different
Next time.
theme top of mind. So,
Yeah, I went down a little rabbit hole. So I don't know if we've talked about it here or much here. So I started my career in the music industry. I probably mentioned that, but this was like at the end of the '90s and the early 2000s, and I was in the indie world, and the indie world was crashing faster than the pop world, but it was the worst time to say my dream job is to go work in the music industry because I got to get there when it was peaking and then got to be there to watch it collapse before I was 25. And collapse, again, it was collapsing. That was my diagnosis at the moment. And we can talk about what that actually means now because there are plenty of people that are saying music is doing great. But during that time, I was doing a lot of interviews and documenting a lot of this. I was blogging. This when blogging was like new to the internet. It was a fresh perspective on things, and I was kind of had an insider point of view. A lot of people in my circle were really invested in this, and it was a multi-generational thing also. I was surrounded by people that had been in that world for 20, 25 years that were like holding on for dear life. How are we going to sell records again? How are we going to keep the record stores alive? And my friends and I in our early 20s going, you guys have been abusing us for a little while. I don't think there's a future to $19 CDs and boy bands the way that you've been shoving us down our throats. I don't know if we can pick and choose the things that we want here, but there's also this beautiful democratization going on called the internet and digital downloads and streaming and all this other amazing stuff that's on the frontier that everyone else is getting their hands on. And the rabbit hole that I started was I found a couple of documentaries on YouTube in the past week on some of my old favorite record stores, other music in New York. I probably put one of their kids through college, the amount of time and money that I spent in that store. And to watch that go under in, I think, 2016, like heartbreaking, like getting misty watching the documentary. But I was watching that thinking, we talk, I don't want to say flippantly or even casually, but I see systems change. That phrase fly around with regularity in our circle, in our proximity. And I think we've said before there's something dangerous to this work. It's not it's irresponsible to think we can just go change things and it won't. We know that things have resonant effects in ways that we'll never understand. But I was watching this thinking, and like as much as I miss record stores, but I remember 25 years ago saying like, yeah, like down with the RIAA. Like screw Metallica for suing all their 15-year-old fans for downloading their records, and like let's break the old business model. And like I was heralding the fall of the old way of doing things. And then I lost my job in the this music distributor record label. It was at Dutch East India, and I ran Homestead Records for its last couple of minutes. And then I watched all my favorite record stores go under, and nothing really replace it. There have been amazing new things that have emerged, but there's still this absence, and there's this lack of community that used to be there. where there was curated work, where there was a sense of soul that I found in that world. I'm not finding now, and there is a this like I don't know, this waterboarding of content that didn't exist before, and now AI slop is just piling that on to a whole other order of magnitude. But that's what's top of mind at the moment. That's not a model for what systems change looks like. There's no model, but I'm thinking about that as a post-mortem, and I wanted to sort of examine that a little bit, or at least use that as a little bit of a provocation, because we talk about systems change. We talk about it might be dangerous, but here's this good thing we can reflect on 25 years ago to say, yeah, things changed. There are some really good things. We can name those really good things, because I'm sure you have a few things that you can tap onto as well. You were there for all that. But also, like, we have to pour some beer out for some of the stuff we lost too. I don't know if there's a structure that has replaced what there was before. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I want to ask the anarchist in you to tell me more about that. So what's coming up for you as I'm rambling here?
Well, a couple things, but I think first and foremost, I almost feel like everything that follows needs a giant asterisk, which is that we are about to apply a bunch of after the fact
Yes.
retroactive coherence or post hoc rationalization to various things that we're about to talk about. We're going to tell a story about what happened that is not actually accurate. Because we have no choice. That's how it works. We have our own, partial and imperfect views of all of the dynamics that played into everything you just described. So right off the bat,
Right.
a topic like this, you can see I just wrote things down. I aroused a couple of different things, and like a lot of the instincts are to be like, yeah, but also this, but that, but this, and this, and this, and like partially there's an instinct towards explanation, to look backwards and look at the dynamics you're talking about and to explain them, not necessarily in a causal way, but just to say, here's what happened, understanding how this all unfolded, how the dominoes fell into each other. Could that give us something useful to know about what we face today and all different other kinds of systems that we're part of? But right off the bat, I have to say, what good is that, right? Because it's a unique and separate situation whereby any level of explaining or coherence we might find in the story of everything that unfolded in the way that you just told it is being sort of laid on top of it by just you and me. So that doesn't like take away obviously the value of what we're about to do, but it's not lost on me that like all of that hangs over this entire chat. The first thing that I wrote down though, and that maybe is a place for me to start, that it kind of hit on me, as you were chatting, is you use the word democratization, and we use that word in a couple different places, a lot more in like design and research stuff these days than maybe others. There are a lot of folks in the design world and UX research in particular who have done a lot of talking, lamenting, complaining, regretting, about the many years during which we heard so much talk of democratizing design, democratizing research. But of course you can apply this to anything. And in many parallel ways, which I suspect are not, small parts of what you were alluding to in terms of some of the parallels, there are similarly unintended consequences of those efforts to democratize research and design and such. And I would kind of back up to ask, what does that fucking mean, to democratize? Because it's a transitive verb in that we're doing the democratizing. Somebody's democratizing. It's not, a system isn't becoming democratized on its own. Usually when you're using this word in this way, you're saying people involved have made some kind of conscious decision to democratize XYZ, or at least to behave in a way that might increase its democratization. And there's some implied moral or ethics or value judgment that that would be a desirable outcome. And I ask right off the bat, is that even true for the music example?
It's not. I'm using the colloquial, like the way we use it when we talk about democratizing design. But what I'm really talking about is sort of a natural redistribution of the power center. Of it's not just big five labels that were determining what ended up being printed on records and what people were able to buy in a record store and bring home and play, or
You're
not
talking
play
about
on a radio.
access, right? So a technology that didn't exist came into existence and got itself into the hands of enough people that through a series of events that I'm obviously way oversimplifying, suddenly more people had more access to more music with lower investment of money or time and presence to go somewhere to acquire it. And access redistributes all kind of things, but it sure as hell is like a change in the energy gradients, so to speak. So I guess the point is more that I don't think it's just like a trivial, this is like a semantic thing. I think it's really important that what happened with music, and what you could argue maybe for other situations, is not that anybody said just this would be morally great if more people had more access to this art. It was a technology became available. And you'll notice I'm not actually highlighting a subject in that. There are subjects, there are people who are responsible for that technology, which we can back up and talk about. But that's this whole other can of worms. The technology is now present, and college kids in dorm rooms have access to it. And I'm downloading things on Napster. And the lower barrier to not just access, but the behavior is a downhill behavior now. The cost of accessing music that way versus going to a record store for many people is far lower. And the other costs that might be less money and maybe more social or cultural, if you're not someone who's been embedded in and entangled with the cultural value of being part of a record store community, you don't see that cost on the ledger. It's simply way cheaper in all forms of human resources to get your music online. So in a way, in my post-hoc telling of this, it's an inevitability. It's not something that I would consider even oh shoot, like we wrought this upon ourselves, but more of another example of when a technology, and I mean that word in the broadest sense of the word, anytime throughout our history. I don't mean inevitability as in this like the wheel is going to turn, get on board or you're an idiot. I mean more that the flow of technological development often includes this form of energy gradient leveling, and suddenly it's an inevitability that the cost of different behaviors change, and so the distribution and choice of different behaviors changes. And you or anyone listening is like, why is Jen going on and on about this? Because I think that is the far more interesting angle here, which is to say, did anybody along the way, think about that outcome? Of course not, because we weren't in the context to be thinking about it. Yes, people were thinking about the material impacts of me losing control over this intellectual property, and depending on what side of any number of economic or ethical or social, ideologies you fall on, you were with Metallica or against Metallica, you were for universal access and no rules anarchism, or you were against it. And then you also could see the potential harm on both sides of either of those poles of, many, many poles. It's not just two. So in a way, there's just, to me, to even think about like, okay, systems change and thinking about these parallels. In much the same way, I think it's futile to even think about systems change as like a directed activity. I also think that this is a good example where this is what happens. This is what we observe,
Hmm.
rather than like, what can we take away from it? What can we learn from it? What might we do differently? Probably nothing. But this is good data to say this is what we observe. This is how things unfold over time. And if you think about where, for example, you made the point, the irony that you, in the early days, you were probably mad that someone like Metallica were suing, and then yet that same unfolding of that process resulted in record stores no longer being a viable business, and that thing you loved went away. There, to me, there's no there's no doing anything about that. And again, I don't mean it in like a fatalist hands up, just whatever. It's more that there's nothing to be done about that other than to decide where you want more or less access or behavior, and then to figure out what is the level of influence or lever that you even have on that, and do what's available to you within that. This is so unsatisfying, I know.
No, it's not. It's not because you brought up a few things which are interesting. So the technology is a thing. Of course it is. Obviously, it wasn't just directly that. It was a, a good example that I remember citing a lot back in those days. Discord Records is still alive and well today. For everyone that doesn't know, Discord is a classic punk label out of DC that is run by Ian MacKaye from originally Minor Threat, now Fugazi, and Fugazi is kind of in deep slumber for the last 20 years or so, but they've kept to we're never going to charge more than like $7 for an LP and $11 for a CD or something along those lines, and we don't do any merchandising, and it's still very much curated by Ian himself, and that has maintained a brand, and they're still able to sell CDs on their terms and do their own thing. Um, that that weathered all of this. That's one example.
Mm-hmm.
There are a number of record stores that survived that, and a lot of many of the reasons that they did that is because they diversified where their income stream was. They knew that they couldn't just sell CDs and have bins of CDs again,
Yeah.
because $19 CDs with a 25% markup wasn't going to keep the doors open anymore. Now they needed to sell record players and merchandise all over the place, and have in-store performances and sell tickets for the venue down the street and all that kind of stuff. But it was also so the technology was not originally written to say we're now going to first of all, it wasn't built with the music industry in mind. I think it was built for gaming ultimately, so that they could get better quality sound in video games. But it was released open source back in like 1994 or something. It really didn't catch on until broadband internet kicked off in like
Mm-hmm.
96, 97. And even then it was still like, I remember back in those days it taking on dial-up, it taking an hour to download a song, and we were exchanging a song at a time, not even an hour, and we were doing it over like chat channels. But it took, there was this a CD printing, CD manufacturing facility in rural North Carolina somewhere, and somebody there was getting early masters and was pulling them aside and ripping them and uploading them, and it was part of the Juarez community back in those days, if you remember Juarez. And if anyone wasn't around back then, Juarez was where people were pirating software, and then it became pirating music as well, and that's where they were ripping CDs and posting them a week before they went live, and that became a big attractor because now Eminem was the big one. Everyone got their hands on an Eminem CD a week before it went live, before it was released. But not only would they get their hands on it, now people could burn CDs, because this was another technology that happened around the same time. So now you could burn these CDs and sell a CDR of the new Eminem for $5-10 on a street corner in New York or in your high school before it's released. And that, of course, sent off plenty of fireworks and agitated everybody. But there was also an entire decade of fans being antagonized and exploited that made all of this really, really attractive. Because I don't think anybody, and this conversation came up almost daily back in those days, do you know that you're stealing? Are you morally okay with theft? And the answer was, under the circumstances, I feel okay about it. That condition had to be generated somehow. And it was either because we all got together and gave each other permission to do it, or it was because everybody was just kind of sick of the shit. But I mean, it started, I think, with the cost of tickets and CDs exploding in the mid '90s, and what happened with the grunge explosion was primarily record labels realized that musicians are assholes, and rather than trying to find these assholes in the wild, let's just go groom a bunch of Disney actresses and actors and turn them into boy bands, because rather than having to go after Gen X money, we can just go after a bunch of preteen parents' money. They're the best salespeople for our product anyway, and then we can have kids that are easily managed and are an easy cash cow. And then we had the pop boom and the boy band boom of the late '90s, early 2000s. And that's what music became, and that was the death throw of that era, right? And so it took all of those things and plenty more. I'm not even naming all of them, but all of those things had to congeal around the same time for this to all come together. The technology was, of course, a huge enabler, but we had to be morally complicit as well.
Yes, on a number of things, but this is going to be like an 18-headed conversation.
Do it.
So when I say technology, though, I don't mean just music sharing software. You could be pedantic about this, but like at first thought it's Napster and everything from that generation. But it is also high-speed internet connections that enable it. Back up further, it's just the literal presence or existence of an internet or even a network, even a non-World Wide Web internet, but in a network, right?
A PC or a laptop, yeah.
Right. Back up even further. How is music shared prior to the internet? Of course, there's still purchasing, but there's also trading of tapes when you have the ability. So a previous technology here would be the ability to record onto tapes or 8 tracks or previous forms of media. So the minute individuals like me and you had access to something that could record, that was not always available, right? That enabled a huge tape trading culture, which again, for our uninitiated friends, was really critical to the origins of certain forms of metal. And go even further, prior to recording musical media, the fucking printing press at this point. Like, how far back do you want to go? How about language? So like when I say technology, I mean it in that big sense, but I'm also not being cute. I mean it like for a reason, because if you take that and abstract it, what we're talking about are the means by which we share aesthetic experiences with each other, create and share. And these technologies didn't enable that in a way that it was not happening prior. It isn't making it possible where it was previously impossible. It simply changes, again, the energy gradients, but like it either accelerates or lowers barriers or changes access, right? And so when I talk about that, I think maybe what I'm thinking about now in the context of this conversation is that is a dynamic that has been present for us as a species since probably the dawn of humans, and frankly, not even just humans. We know that animals do many of these types of things in their own way. And the the dynamic at play here around creating and sharing these artistic and social aesthetic experiences together has simply been modulated and over time modified. We've made the technology and then the technology makes us.
Right.
And all throughout the history of that happening over millennia, I would argue that there have been temporarily coalescing, I guess is the phrase I'm looking for. I'm into the word coalescence lately, partly just because it got stuck in my brain from other shit, but we can come back to that. But think about it any way you want. Think about it instead of that as an eddy, or think about it around the notion that you can regard in physics, a particle as a physical piece of matter, but it's also actually just an excitation in a field. So like a temporary, so whatever, however you want to think about it, a temporary thing. If that, ages old dynamic around the way that we create and share this type of experience with each other has these momentary, temporary things that exist that coalesce into a thing and has some thingness. Record stores are an example of that to me. And so it makes sense to think about how in the ongoing like river that is humans engaging with each other in this way, creating and sharing in this way, there have been little eddies or things that happen for a while. And there was an eddy in this river that was the existence of the concept of a record store when the technologies that existed at that time made that a relevant thing to exist. But at a certain point, now prior to the first record stores in the form that we know them, it simply was that the media and the technology and maybe the human interaction didn't exist in a way that made that a thing. And then it existed for a while. And then the technologies, again, which don't exist in isolation from us, as an extension of us, shift and evolve so that the concept of a record store no longer holds, because the nature by which we create and share this stuff, that thing dissolves. And so in a way, I think about a record store as just one example that we've had the privilege of observing it go through that experience in our lifetime. Some things probably come together with a much longer lifetime, maybe more cultural type institutions. Other things exist for tinier flashes in the pan, like certain MP3 players as devices could be an example where the combination and interaction of the human dynamics and the technologies that we create as extensions of ourselves make relevant and possible for a short time, and then later they're no. So in a way, right, what I kind of wanted to get at with the technology comment, and I realize I'm completely ignoring like the last thing you said, but we'll come back to it. All of the factors and the dynamics and our complicitness in everything that's unfolded over the last, say, 30 years that you were bringing back into it in the conversation, to me just feel like really good examples of that whole like abstract picture that I've just painted. And so to ask, or to say, to grieve that record stores don't exist in that way. Some have survived because what's happened is, they've either, like you've said, found other ways of existing, or the nature of their particleness for that brief moment of time where they are a particle that is an excitation in the field that has a thingness to it. It's fleeting for all of us, but fleeting on what time scale varies. And so something has shifted in a way that some of them exist. But I also, you and I know there's something about record stores that isn't simply just there's a physical space that holds physical media. In fact, if that's all a record store was, then we would call the internet a record store, and I guess some people can and do. But you and I are talking about the cultural and the social experience of a record store, the community aspect of a record store, the curation that you've mentioned. And side note, and I feel like we might have talked about this a little bit, but I'm not even really a good example of a record store kid. I spent a lot of time in record stores, especially in my 20s, but I would go to the record store with friends and often felt like I was the one who was kind of just chilling and kind of patiently tolerating our time there. I certainly went to record stores looking for things and would talk to people. I had the experience that makes it special, and I lamented the end of the record store for all these reasons. But for me, it was almost like I got things that I think others were we're getting or experiencing in the record store, I experience from other places, and I have the fortune that a lot of those things still exist, still have some thingness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if those go away, and by example, those, just literal shows. I still go to a lot
Right.
of shows, and those haven't gone away. They did temporarily during
Yeah.
COVID. And that was when I felt a level of grief on par with, I think what a lot of people feel about the death of the record store. But to that end, I'll pause here in a second, but like that is the picture that is like emerging for me here. And if you take that picture that I've tried to paint, you can think about almost any anything system as this like flowing river. And I always am so itchy about the word inevitability because it gets weaponized as like AI is inevitable. Come on, embrace this like terrible technology that is so harmful and da 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 da. But if you don't just blindly say yes to it, you're a Luddite and you're an idiot. Like that is not at all what I mean by inevitability. And then it also gets confused with like either the fatalism or the lotus eating and all of those other things you can lobby at someone, but those are not it. And so by inevitability, I mean more that there is simply this like metaphorical river that is a flow over time of the confluence of factors and interactions and dynamics. And while we can't dam the river, despite at times in all our modernity have tried, what we can do is kind of understand some things, form a coalescence or an eddy for a longer period than others, and recognizing what we like about something if it's sort of starting, if we're seeing the signals, learning to see the signals of when that might be breaking up or when the presence of something else, whether it's a technology or some other norm or something that is kind of happening, is sort of leading to the breakup and the disillusion of this thing we love. Yes, there's probably certain things we can do to delay or mitigate that process, but to me the biggest question has always been, where does it make sense to hold on to something, and where does it make sense to try to figure out where the next source for whatever goodness that thing is bringing to you can come from.
Yeah. Uh, all right. So,
Sorry.
yes, the 18-headed Hydra. I knew this was going to be juicy because it wasn't just going to sit in this one spot. There's so
We
much
can also just talk
to
about
this.
record stores. You want to just talk about records and record stores? Because
I
there's
mean, that
lots of
alone
stories.
could run us
Talk about high
until.
fidelity.
Oh, love hate. It's too close to home.
I bet.
Yeah. I was definitely a record store kid. I definitely like there were multiple around my house, just in the little town I grew up in, and yeah, would spend like afternoons in the summer just pulling CDs off the shelf and listening and reading the backs of CDs to see what label everything's on and who's in what band, and if it was open, I'd just read the liner notes right there, and I was like deep in
Yeah.
it. And I think, I don't know if we've talked about it here or not. You and I have talked about this is when we used to like, this is a record label I recognize. I'm just going to buy it. Or this band thanked this other band. I'm buying
They're
it.
wearing the
And
shirt in the liner note photo. That was
exactly,
it.
yeah,
Everything this begat this. You just follow.
right.
Yeah.
I like that Dream Theater song, and he's wearing the Napalm Death's shirt in the video. I'm getting some Napalm Death. That wasn't what I was expecting from the guy in
Yeah.
Dream Theater to be wearing. Yeah, and there's a huge satisfaction in that too. This is one of those things that you just couldn't. You don't get from the online record store, from the repository of media,
Yeah.
the actual the labor of love that went into that exploration of I found a thing, and it's exclusively mine. Not the thing is mine. The relationship is mine. The
Finding.
discovery,
Finding
yeah.
yours.
The berries that I'm foraging are the tastiest berries I've ever
Exactly.
had.
That's
right?
literally what I
Nobody,
was going to say. This is information foraging, is what you're
right?
really about.
Yeah.
I mean, well, I have two thoughts, but was there more to come? Because I interrupted you.
I was gonna go. You were talking about inevitability, and I think you were pointing that towards some like technology or how our relationship to technology. And what was what immediately came up for me, which is the first sort of like break in the clouds that I've had in this sort of post mortem, was like, there's an inevitability in our need to also have our social structures, our
Yeah.
identities, or the our missing identities, our attractors that are part of our health at the end of the day. We're just as much social creatures as we are biological creatures, and so that is a force that is not being answered by the repository of online music. Spotify isn't
No,
satisfying that need.
no, that's long gone from
Yeah,
in that
and
world.
yes, shows are there, and yeah, like you, I went, shows were a thing, but shows weren't a thing where like I would go. I wasn't walking up to strangers and picking up conversation with people at shows. Where in a record store, that was much more. For some reason, for me, that was much more accessible. But
Yeah.
shows were still a people where I could look around and say like, I'm home here. This is so.
Hmm.
There was an
Hmm.
element of that,
Yeah.
but it wasn't the place where I'd go and just like geek out. And before I know it, it's like three
Yeah.
hours later. I'm like, I've been talking nonstop for 3 hours with this person, and I'm like I'm. This is an intimate relationship with a total stranger, but instead
It's,
it
you know,
was we're all experiencing this thing intimately together
yeah.
without saying a word. It was different, but similar.
And I mean, again, it's also very personal,
Right.
because so that's, well, I'll come back to shows in a second, but it
Yeah.
ties to this because all of this has me thinking a lot. When you were talking about, when you said information foraging, or you said foraging, and I had literally written it down like right before you wrote it. I mean, right before you said it, because it occurred to me as you were chatting, there are probably people for whom record store culture and this experience is just completely foreign, either because of their age or just how they grew up.
Yeah.
But it occurs to me one of the most relatable analogs for a lot of people might be the library. Now, again, not
Mm-hmm.
everybody grew up going to the library, but that experience of going to a library, especially in the age where you might use a card catalog, or for whatever reason you don't just like punch in an order and receive what you ordered, right? You walk down to the stacks and you look for maybe something, but you're also kind of just browsing everything in that section, or like, oh my gosh, that thing has a super cool looking cover. What the fuck is that? You take it down, you're reading, you're like, I'm gonna get this. And then, you might do the equivalent of, if you're in a record store, read the liner notes, maybe even put it on if there is, a turntable or a CD player in the record store to listen to it, and that's welcome. Like in a library, you sit down and you actually start reading through something, and then you might decide if you want to take something home or not, whether you're buying it or whether you're borrowing it from the library or what have you. I suspect if there are folks for whom the record store experience doesn't resonate, the library, especially if you were a dorky library kid, I'm sure there are plenty for whom they go, oh, that was my record store. And now it's missing the social piece. We'll come back to that. But there is the information foraging aspect here that is just so critical. And I thought I would say this too, just for the benefit of people who might be paying attention. There's a lot of interesting discourse around this happening right now in our broader sort of information complexity, systems world. There are a lot of cool, smart people writing very cool, interesting things about information foraging. If you're not plugged into that world, do some information foraging for yourself and find out. I actually even talked a brief bit about this in my talk at the Information Architecture Conference in April, not really as like an expert, but just as kind of an opening, salvo into something else. But I used this metaphor, and everybody loves a card catalog, at least people of a certain age. And you think about the difference when we move to search, like on Google, and you move to a level of you're still doing some foraging because you get your search results. You get like whatever 10 on the page in the olden days. You still had to do some level of evaluating. You still would click into a link and go, is this quite what I'm looking for? Not sure. Back out, try another one. Like you were doing some of that discernment and judging and evaluating. So there was still a bit of that serendipity. You might find something you weren't expecting and it would be like, ooh.
Mm-hmm.
And then over time, of course, search has gotten more and more, well, it's gotten something. We'll put an adjective there, to be determined. And nowadays, if you've got your like AI summary, the metaphor goes from like foraging in the woods, looking for maybe particular mushrooms, but in the process coming across an incredible, flower or something, hearing an amazing bird sing. I've probably used this metaphor on this chat even in the past. To like a search to me strikes me as like being in a grocery store produce section. It's laid out for you, but you're still picking up the right one and deciding which one you want and need. You're just not in the woods coming across this incredible, totally unexpected thing. And then now like AI returning a result or a chat bot or something like that, a summary, is like having DoorDash delivered, right? And it's not a value judgment. There are times for which that latter is what is appropriate. But I think just being mindful of the difference is a really unique challenge for our day. So now bringing that back to like the notion of libraries or record stores and the social component, I think is worth calling out because I obviously got the information foraging and like serendipitous aesthetic. I mean, it wasn't just about information for me at the library. Okay, where it was like spiritual. You guys know, right? So like but it wasn't the social aspect. In fact, that was a bonus for me, was that it was in solitude, that it was me, myself, and I, and all the dead authors of all those books that I was finding. So I was in communion with the authors who weren't present, or the ideas or the characters if it was fiction, right? Rather than with real life human beings, which for a kid like me was safer and more comfortable and kind of what I wanted. But as I got a little older and did start to do more things like go to shows, now my experience of going to shows, punk, hardcore, and metal shows in my like late teens through 20s and 30s, and obviously still today, but it's different, is exactly what you got from the record store. So it wasn't just in a room with strangers and a few friends. The community that I was part of through most of my 20s while I was in Pittsburgh, and to an extent it's true here in Boston as well, but obviously things change over time. In Pittsburgh, it would be at a show space that had like a max occupancy of 100, and that was if it was uncomfortably packed. A show might have 50 kids at it. And even if you didn't know everybody there, which often you didn't, you did walk up to each other. And it wasn't just because you had the shared taste or, we came to see this band, so we obviously have something in common. It was also like, I'm wearing the shirt of such and such band. Or there's a circle of people just talking to each other, and you kind of walk over and stand there, and they're exchanging, oh, do you have this? I just listened to this. Did you get this record? It was doing the record store thing, but not in the physical listening to the media. So it was doing the social piece minus the physical media, right? And the media in this case was replaced by the performance of a live band. So in some ways, like, take what is in that little coalescing eddy of a record store as a moment in time of that human instinct, and maybe you just kind of deconstruct or peel apart or recombine, like you've deconstructed and recombined the pieces in different ways and other stuff. And I'd be really curious, listeners, like, what are the other things out there that do this? Because we've got, shows, record stores, libraries. I can think of a bunch, but I'm curious for others too.
I hear comic book stores have a similar vibe. I did not grow up in comic book stores.
Oh my God. Okay, Magic the Gathering.
Sure. Yep. That's that passed me. But what occurred to me when you were talking about this, that foraging, I won't say like all creative pursuits, but I find things where, like, not when I'm writing music, but when I learn a song, there's a similar relationship. When I cook a recipe, when I've done a woodworking project, when it's me not necessarily creating something from scratch, that's a little different. When it's really like novel and it's mine, it's different. But when I am putting a bit of labor into a thing that has a sort of ideal outcome, it's an outcome that I can kind of visualize, that has been produced somewhere else before for the most part. It's very similar to that foraging, and the reason is the level of labor that goes into it and the personalization that becomes that relationship through that labor is now. It's not just that I like that band, or that album. It's how I found that album. It's where I was when I first listened to it. It's the fact that I didn't like the album the first 5 times I heard it, but the 6th time something clicked. Those things are absolutely inseparable. And like that. That's the same thing as the shelves that I built that I had to throw out a component 3 times because I didn't get the cut right, or the horrible tacos that I made the one night. Like, all of that is very similar to the 30 bands that I button smashed my way through to find the one that just went, holy shit, how did I not know these guys existed?
Yeah.
It's that labor and the meaning that comes with it.
It's encoded in, it's like in the bodies, and I mean body like human bodies, but it's
Mm-hmm.
in the body social that is the
Mm-hmm.
social organism, and it's encoded in all of what's been enacted to get there. It's funny, I didn't expect this, but this is actually kind of in the spirit of the piece I put on Medium last week too, right? Like
Yeah.
it's very much a function of realizing that even if you know you want to get there, it's never as simple as go from here to there. I mean, sometimes it is, but it's so there's so much encoded in the interactive, the doing, even if it's just you interacting with non human things, you know. And there's something that's encoded in the process that can't be extracted from. It's like entangled forever in the meaning of the thing. You can't take it away. And for better or for worse. I mean, I'm sure you've
Right.
and many have had the experience of something that is painful that I've tried to reclaim, and to more and less extent in some different cases, the pain that is associated with something because of an experience that's tied up with it, you know?
The
Trigger
people that
warning?
you associate to some of the music, like
Yeah.
I remember the old school guys at in not just Dutch East, but in the indie music New York scene. When I would show up and say I'm a huge Tool fan, and they would be like, "You're one of those idiots." I'm like, what do you mean? Have you ever heard of these guys? Yeah, but you're just like one of those neckbeards walking around with a Tool shirt. I'm like, I don't know what a Tool shirt, but I'd wear one because they're amazing. Have you ever heard them? No, I don't listen to like. You're all wearing Misfits shirts. Come on, like, did you get it a Hot Topic? And like, this was the sort of banter that went back and forth all the time. But it carries that context. The person that plays this sort of like, and then this is where we get our guilty pleasure from. Like, I have to like, I roll up my windows when I listen to Deftones because I want to be as, I'm like, I'm
You know
not.
what?
I'm a grown man. I'm not sore about the prom that
Sure.
I didn't go to. You know, I can listen, but I still like the Deftones here and there. Some of their albums, anyway.
Okay, first of all, why is Deftones showing up everywhere lately in like every conversation? I just want to tell
Really,
everybody, I don't know who hurt you, but it's okay to just listen to the fucking Deftones, you guys. Just get over it. Go to therapy about
it's
it.
so
Okay?
infantile, though. It's
I
really,
mean, well, as an aside, I don't know if we've talked Deftones before. I liked the first 2 albums when I came out. I
yeah.
was the right age. I liked them a lot. I owned
The
them,
first
and I might still have them, but
4, maybe.
I didn't really follow much after that. I didn't care for it. But I don't know what is happening with the universe and throwing Deftones at me lately. But Tool's another good example of this, and I don't just want to talk about it because we want to just get off on a tangent, but
Right.
think about everything we're talking about right now in relation to, like, we like to pretend that collaboration either in a workplace or in a community that is like outside of just like social fun, like something that's supposed to be serious, that's supposed to try to accomplish something important, that somehow like these things don't apply, and we know they do, and we try to either, I don't think anybody actually just pretends that these dynamics don't exist, but we try to like minimize or work around or contain them instead of just say, you know what, we can't. This is why, you know, that thing in your organization, no matter how on paper it makes total sense, immediately goes to shit or is a third rail, because it's the equivalent of like, that song is a breakup song, and that person will never ever ever not have a fucking bodily
Right.
reaction to it, even if their brain doesn't care because they were 16 and they're 50 now. Like, it, you can't fight some of those encoded meanings that are part of being in the world. And so instead of fighting it, again, it's not always just throw your hands up and be like at its mercy, but learn how to move with it and not ignore that it exists, because you do more harm that way. So doing that in the business and corporate sense is its own challenge, and I feel like at this point in my career it's like the central challenge. But the Tool thing is a fun example because I am a Tool fan. I was a big Tool fan when I was younger, and I also had that experience whereby I felt like every other goddamn Tool fan that I encountered was straight insufferable, and I had to reckon with,
Yes.
are we the baddies? Like, am I
Them as a
insufferable?
band as well.
But
Yeah.
well, yeah. I mean, they've also at this point in 2026,
Right.
I will admit that I don't really listen to more later like Tool, and I also
Same.
do not love.
Yeah, I'm with you.
But like the first, again, I hate being I like the first four albums, but like the first several albums, right?
I
They're fantastic. I listen to
I
them all the
think
time.
Enema is the greatest album ever made.
Dude, Opiate, put on fucking Opiate and go, man. It's
Opium, it's
great.
amazing, but I think Enema is
Very
the
good.
greatest album ever recorded, and
Really? Is
I
that your
have stood
top?
by that
Is
for
that your
20
top
years.
like number one
That is
album of
my
all time?
number one album of all
I
time.
want everybody. This is being recorded. Let the record
Yep,
show Kyle Gabby's number one album of
I
all
have
time.
stood
Well
by
done.
this for 2 decades.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's up there. It's up there for me. It is like it is a masterpiece.
Yep.
Well, so but think about this now. So like, Tool fans are insufferable, and why is that? And then it became a function of, well, do I want to distance myself? Do I do the thing that's like, I like Tool, but not like that, which is its own fraught psychic split you create for yourself, because it's not unlike when women, which is largely a process of how we are socialized. It's never really like a woman at fault, but like a lot of women are like, I'm not like other women, right? We're doing it out of safety to distance ourselves and to, be the whatever. So we'll leave those gender dynamics aside. That's a 4-hour conversation. But the women who do the I'm not like other women thing, or another common place this comes up, and I'll leave this as we don't have to get too deep down into this one. We'll get ourselves censored. But like in the world of pole dance and aerial arts, especially pole dance in particular types of pole dance, and I mean like the ones recreation for fun, not in strip clubs.
Right.
But all of that has its origin in strip clubs, in sensual dance, and lots of places that touch from various adjacent like points, like actually dancing for the male gaze, right? Like you can't pretend it doesn't. And there are a lot of women who get into pole dance as sport or exercise or recreation, who kind of early on will make a point to be like, not a stripper. There's a whole hashtag on Instagram. Hashtag not a stripper. It's look how strong and acrobatic I am doing these incredible
Right.
things on the pole, but I'm not a stripper. And so, and of course, all of these are problematic. So, in the same way that most people who spend enough time in the pole dance and aerial arts community, of which I am obviously one, if you cannot tell, you come to understand like that makes no sense to be like that. You don't have to embrace and say I am a stripper, especially if you're not. But there is like a level of understanding and integration, not just of you as an individual and your identity that is part of, but in some ways, in opposition to this bigger identity, that you are also the current instantiation of a long-standing chronological thing, path dependency, whatever. So all that said, Tool fan, I'm like, am I insufferable like the other Tool fans? But then what happens is that if you don't do the I'm not like other Tool fans, you also over time start to encounter other Tool fans who like Tool the way you do. And I don't mean to be like I'm the right kind of Tool fan and they're the wrong kind,
Right.
but people find different things in things that they like. And so there are people who like Tool for very different reasons than I like Tool, or we might gush about different aspects of Tool, whether it's the musicianship or the lyrics or just some other general thing. And so there are, and this is true for all forms of metal, and I find this is very true with horror movies too, right? And there's so many good examples where first instinct might be to say, I'm a this, but I'm not that kind of this. But at the same time, if you do that, you shut off or foreclose on the possibility of actually finding the other folks who are this and they're your type of this. And so how much of the danger zone are you willing to be associated with to find those special moments and connections that are out there? So now take that into a business setting and think about what you're asking of your colleagues and your clients when you're talking about what kind of things you want people to be associated with or collaborate in and be complicit in. That's all. I'll stop
Yeah.
there.
And I mean, it doesn't take much. Like, all you have to do is like turn on a Tool record, and all of that sort of disappears, and you're just like, all right, we're singing Enema together. Like, it doesn't matter what generation you are, or what our on ramp was, or how many of those shirts you have, and if your mom bought them for you or not, or whatever. Like, none of that matters. We're just enjoying it. And where I find this in organizations is when I start, I'm the new person coming in, and I'm doing some of these contextual interviews, and I hear, the problem is people have been here for so long, and they're just fixed in their ways, and I say, okay, well, how long have you been here? Like, I've been here 20 years, but my experience is a little different. And then I hear their story, and I go, okay, well, that's great. And then everyone I talk to, they've got a different story, but everybody else, they're ossified in some way. They're problematic in some way. They're not. I'm the snowflake. There's something I need to illustrate what differentiates me from them. And it becomes really clear, like, well, okay, we have to find what unifies. We don't have to spend any energy to differentiate. Okay,
Yeah.
there's, that might be apparent. We need to invest in the unification so that we can actually
Yeah.
move forward on something
Well, and
here.
in that case, make no mistake, I don't think you mean it this way, but for anyone watching, it isn't just, oh, let's invest in the unification in the sense that we have to do the unifying.
Not,
It's
yeah.
what do you need to put in front of folks? How do you give them visibility to each other in a way that they start to see that? In much the same way everyone usually wants to collapse difference because it's uncomfortable and conflict and blah 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 blah, right? How do you
Yeah,
allow
not
people to just
consensus.
hold some difference and just have some
Right?
disagreement literacy or whatever you want to call it and just operate with that as a default? You and I aren't going to come in and be like, look, you're unified, right? Like
Right.
it's so much more about just like, what if we all just take a step to the left? What looks different now? Oh, okay. Whoa, I didn't realize. Blah blah blah. So
But there's a tool record to be played. For all those people that have been there for 20 years pointing at each other saying, you're the ossified one, everybody was there the day that there was that big layoff that they all
yeah,
survived. And they all get to sit around that campfire and
yeah.
tell that story
Or
together.
who identifies that? Not you.
Right.
They
Right.
do.
Right.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what can we do to provoke that campfire? How do we light that campfire? That's it.
Yeah. Or how do you give them
So,
all matches? If you distribute enough matches and enough oil, kerosene.
hopefully it's the campfire they start with
Well, this
those
is where you and
matches.
I differ, Kyle, but that's totally fine.
Yeah, I would prefer the unification there. I don't mind some things being burned down, but then what happens is my dream career collapses in front of me, and there go the record stores that I love too, and then that gets lamented, and I don't think at any. I mean, again, in retrospect, it was like, great, the major labels are collapsing. This is going to be amazing. The indie labels. This is like who we get to give our love to now. There was a bunch of college kids that were supporting them that had no money whatsoever, and they were, they
Yeah.
misspent money all over the place. They dug their own graves. We
Yeah.
dug our own graves, and they had no hope. I mean, it was such a misdirected hope that they would weather all of that.
Look, if hope's not misdirected, it's not hope.
Fair enough. But then there was all the collateral damage
Yeah.
of the record stores. But at the same time, I remember an interview with why am I'm losing names a lot recently. I used to be able to name like everybody in every band,
Perimenopause,
and
isn't it?
that's what it is. Yes, it is. My brain is
I hear that comes
going
with
through
brain
it.
fog.
That's it. Black Flag.
Rollins, or do you mean?
Yes, thank you, Henry
Okay.
Rollins. Come on, well, how do I forget Henry Rollins? So one of my favorite music nerds. So Henry Rollins was being asked like, and this is maybe 2005, 2008, something like that. How's music doing? And he said, like, music's doing great. What are we talking about here? Like, record labels are doing awful, and that's great for music. Nobody wants to get signed anymore. That's the change, and that's amazing. Like, where does music come from? It's on that website. Somebody has a copy of that tape or that CD. They're trading it. That's how you get it. We're back to photocopies
Yeah.
as being the cover art that we're making again. That's how it was supposed to be, and we're recording it
Yeah.
in our garage in ways that we couldn't do before. And we're establishing new labels out of the garage, and we're doing prints of 50 of these things, and we're passing them around.
Yeah.
And it was great. Unfortunately, I think COVID, at least in the U.S., damaged a lot of that, because there's no money in that. There was only money in working musicians that could tour. And when you had 2-3 years where musicians couldn't tour anymore, they had to go get day jobs, and they had to get health insurance and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I found a lot of those guys dropped off. Europe was fine because they don't have to go get health insurance, and they have subsidized art over there, and so they were maintained. But in the U.S., I found a lot of my favorite bands that used to tour once, twice a year were suddenly incognito
Yeah.
after
But I think
2019.
it hits the it hits different pockets and communities differently.
Hmm.
Because I mean, to say the same, I saw the same in certain aspects, or certain parts of the music community that I'm part of, or bands that I liked. And there was definitely a bit of like a recovery, refraction period, if you will, after like COVID. But it was like, it was also interesting because in much the same way like a great flood might like take out a bunch of stuff, like, or a forest fire, is obviously destructive. It also clears away any number of things that make new things possible. And as a tiny, tiny little aside, one thing I remember noticing, I remember my husband and I talked about this. So in Boston, and this gets kind of niche for some of our people, but you've got like hardcore, then you've also got like hardcore. Then there's actually this third kind of hardcore. So to spare folks, there's like hardcore like punk, which is like punky, thrashy, crusty, like however, whatever adjective somebody might know. And there's this other form of hardcore that is more like if you ever see videos of guys in like high school Letterman jackets, people like really looking like they're trying to hurt each other in the pit, crowd killing as they call it, and punch crews. There's, if any of that resonates for anybody. So if you don't know the differences, don't worry about it. But the point is, Boston's had a long history of these many like different streams of hardcore existing, and there are plenty of folks who like all. So I mean, there are many of us who would be at any number of these different types of shows. But there is, there's also stuff that comes along with like certain parts of that community having a real tough guy, you know, I wouldn't say unwelcoming, but you kind of had to be like willing to be a certain kind of person and stand up for yourself and not get punched in the face. Um, that kind of hardcore had a real lull post COVID. And there was this who knows why? I mean, it could be that a lot of the bands that were playing that kind of hardcore right around COVID were a little on the older side. So
Hmm.
they had the same COVID in sort of, enforced retirement, if you will. But what it left was suddenly this wide open space for, on one hand, other types of music, but also younger as well. In the domains where there's a little less of that, like you got to earn your right to come up through. Some places enforce that more than others in the community, and so there was this really interesting, like maybe 2 year period post COVID when all the lockdowns were opened up and live music started happening again, where it was just like, wow, there's so much crazy, weird, cool stuff happening that just feels like it wouldn't have had enough oxygen or room to exist in Boston hardcore until something weird happened that kind of turned down the knob on this other kind of hardcore. Now it's come back, and I don't mean it's come back in this pesky weed kind of way. It's come back in its own new way, new bands, members of old bands recombining, and it's great. It's lovely. Everything kind of lives in like a nice dynamic equilibrium. But I think that to your point about COVID being this interesting disruptor, it has really locally different effects on things, and there's no way to predict it, right? So
Right.
as much as like take the record store, and like your dream job went away when that thing
Right.
ceased to exist, but your dream job didn't go away in the other sense, which is the aspects of record stores and the structure, the infrastructure around them. The aspects of that would have been a dream job for you exist in other
Hmm.
places. They just might now exist
Sure.
in a distributed way that make it such that a single dream job might not touch on all of them equally, but there's some other thing that is coalesced, or there are multiple coalescences or eddies or momentary excitations of the field that achieve or make possible the same kind of things that are core to what you want. Plus, you are also moving with the current. You are a current
Hmm.
or an eddy. You are a coalescence right now, and you are
Right.
different than you were 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 30
Certainly.
years ago. So, again, in some ways, it's so hard not to hear all of this and be like, cool, we just sound like a bunch of woo woo weirdos.
Back
But
when I
like when
was.
I walk into a corporate environment to work with a client, this is what I am bringing in. I just can't always use any of this language. But like,
Hmm.
even just getting people to a point in a project where they think what they bought was your partnership in achieving XYZ outcome, that's fine. That's fine. I'm not going to straight up lie, but like, that's not really what they bought, right? Like they bought this thing, and what they're going to then receive out of this is going to actually be something they themselves build, not me do for them. And all of that's happening because if you were someone who was hyper fixated on the record store and the record store ceased to exist, and you continue to hyper focus on the record store and the absence of the record store and the mirage of what a record store can be in 2026, and you stay hyper fixated on that, I mean, think about what happens in any number. I mean, that is what happens when people experience trauma and have, struggle with PTSD. That is I shouldn't even draw that comparison, I'm sorry guys, metaphor, but there are notions around the way that humans engage, and groups of humans engage, and when you stay fixated or unable to allow the letting go and the breaking up of things, nothing else can move. So I hate intensely with a passion people who walk into corporate environments and kind of consider themselves corporate therapists in that way. So that's why I bristle and wish I could just delete the PTSD example, but in the spirit of vulnerability and honesty, I'll just leave it. But it is not unlike that, in that a partnership or an engagement with an outside consultant can still be that one little thing that just, oh wait, we could probably look at this thing that's forming over here. There are aspects of this eddy that might actually bring us closer to what we want, instead of focusing all our energy on this thing that no longer exists. I just sound like I'm telling you people to let go and move on, and it's not quite that. Move
Yeah, no,
on,
and
guys.
there might be some fairness in the PTSD component too, because people do cling on to safe things, and that safe thing may not be the thing that the rest of us consider advantageous
Right.
to anyone else. But that doesn't mean that that's not the most stable thing that that person has been able to
Right.
grab
And when
onto
I say it
for
too,
whatever
I
reason.
mean, for anybody who's experienced it, we all know, well, we meaning the collective field of people who are serious about things, which is a funny thing to say. Like the understanding, the modern understanding of PTSD from a embodied and a cognitive sense, it's not a choice, right? I know that, we all know that, but like, it's when it's embodied and when the body is reacting to something as a threat that really isn't a threat, but it still needs to read as a threat because it's a lot safer.
Yeah,
Exactly, that is the dynamic that I'm trying to draw on. not
exactly.
not to be like, just heal yourself and get on with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other thing that I bring in that this retrospective is making me think of is it's a good story of the unintended consequences. The
Yeah.
number of times where I remember, I mean, being in an organization that used all Windows software, and Google's coming in. Awesome. I can't wait to get rid of this Outlook bullshit. Great. Google Day One just came about, and everyone's like ready to flip their desk because they can't find their stuff. You were the biggest advocate for this. Yeah, but I didn't know they were gonna do my contact list doesn't make any sense, and everything's, it used to be first name last name, now it's last name first name, and it takes me 5 extra clicks to get to where I want to go. Okay, well, like, that's, you'll get used to it. First of all, like, a month from now, you won't even remember this happened unless you have to tell this story to everybody, and then it's going to be second nature. But come on, like, there are the things that these changes that we want, the things that we are going in and intentionally trying to destabilize to an extent. Like, I, I've, I'm going through with so much more caution these days, realizing that there's so much more that comes with it, and
Yeah.
yeah, thinking about like my record store, like Warner Records is still here, but other music is not, and that
You
sucks.
know, okay. I think that's an interesting one to hear you say I'm being more thoughtful about destabilization. Um, I think there's something there that probably a lot of folks in this world experience, where now maybe it depends on how and where they work and the context and what level of control or influence you have to do the
Hmm.
destabilizing. But I remember having a lot of conversations about this when I was leading a pretty big team at the other agency, and there was a level of desire from some parts of the org to loosen things up a little bit in the sense of like you're repotting a plant, and when you take it out, you if it's root bound, you want to loosen it. You don't grab it and do this, in a careless way, but just to loosen the soil and get a little oxygen up in there, right? And so then when you put it in its new, bigger, better pot, but right, you get it. So
Hmm.
there's that. There are notions of like creative destabilization, right?
Yeah.
And those related ideas. But then there's also the folks who are like, I just want to see the world burn, just want to be an
Hmm.
agent of chaos because it's part of their identity or because they're working through their own shit. And it's really easy to kind of lose or to never have in the first place a kind of view of which is which. And especially if you're in a leadership role and you are taking actions that you might characterize as just loosening the soil a little bit versus, oh God, this is so like disruptive and upending. I just want to do my job and go home. What are we doing, right? I think there's never a way to avoid, can't make everyone happy, right? But there's a little bit of this, like, maybe it's not unlike the Don Quixote phase that we've talked about, but
Hmm.
whereby I see people want to kind of bust in like Kool-Aid Man and like be the complexity that they want to see others navigating in the world. And there's like a kind of a coming of age where you go, wait a minute, maybe just like wailing around in here with creative destabilization as my flag is not quite the way. I think it's
Well,
like a maturity thing or an
yeah.
experience thing. Yeah, I don't know.
I'll give you another one, and this I'm curious what you'll take from this because this is the first time I'm going to air this out,
Ooh,
and I'm doing this on a recording here.
I love this.
So yeah, I'm gonna
Do
let me get the
tell,
couch here.
Kyle. Tell
Yeah.
us everything.
So I will I'll be on a bunch of calls and in a group of people, and I'll hear somebody throw the like, and that's why we have to remove the patriarchy. And like this, none of this. Yeah, and I know that the patriarchy is not just like remove men from power. It's like
Yeah.
it's like decolonization. We need to like get past the idea of dominance as a way of being, and dozens of other things. I don't need to tell you. If you want to explain it to everyone else, you can do so probably much better than I can. You spent a lot more time in this space. But and I'm also one of those people that says I feel like I benefit from equity in that it's I get to learn and I get to see more, and that's amazing. But I also have to know that at some point I'm going to be that guy that had the my Outlook list
Yeah.
breakdown, and
Yeah.
I'm going to go, wait, what the fuck happened here? And so it hasn't happened yet. But if it's working, like I don't, if I have to admit that I don't even know the depth of my own position or privilege, then I have to know that if these things are even possible, then I can't
Yeah.
know when bottoms will drop out.
Yeah.
And that's part of that. We need to move cautiously, and to some extent, like I'm not the only face of that. We will
Right.
all be in that position in one way or another. As somebody in the indie music scene, thinking if only the big record labels were gone, then the rest of us will flourish. That was misguided
Yeah.
because
Well,
that
I
didn't
mean,
work out.
how you know whether something is like load bearing and whether something is,
Sure.
part of the infrastructure that hold us down versus part of the infrastructure that holds us up and keeps us safe, and like spoiler, sometimes they're one and the same,
Right.
you can't really even know that
Hmm.
until after or never. And that, I mean, this is where so much of the importance that I think just gets glossed over and accepted, like completely unmetabolized, of small experiments and micro little nudges and safe to fail probes and blah, blah, blah. Like the whole point of trying to do little wiggles and nudges isn't just to keep it safe to fail. Like there's so much emphasis on small and like a portfolio of things. But I think what people maybe, I don't know, until we're talking about it right now, I haven't really thought about it quite this way, but I think sometimes people do lose sight of the other piece of it, which is that it is meant to teach you something.
Hmm.
Now, it may not be the sole purpose. Like you might run an experiment per se that you know is not actually going to achieve an end, but is run solely for the purpose of learning something. But I'm also
Hmm.
talking about like, let's make a bet. Let's try these three things. Only one of them can actually be the one that we end up doing, but like, let's do all three. And as long as they're low enough investment, it's okay and blah, blah, blah. But like, this is where I think people maybe really quickly just like drink the Kool-Aid of, oh, it's a complex system, not just complicated. So we can't actually analyze and just do the right thing. We need to run small experiments and safe to fail probes. And it's like the buzzwords just pour out of your mouth. But to address exactly the dynamic that you're talking about, you and I and anybody else, it's hard to assess whether my resistance to change is because I am a privileged white cis het lady, or if it is because the actual ways we have evolved together to work on something actually are like, again, load bearing in a way that none of us can recognize, because the load bearingness of the stuff is because of our entangledness and not because somebody somewhere said this is how it has to be.
Hmm.
And you can't always know until you pull the string and see what else moves with it.
And
Yeah.
it's our stakeholders and our clients too who nobody calls us and says we need to change something to the point that I don't recognize the environment that I'm in anymore.
What about the transformation efforts, Kyle? Isn't that what they
Right.
want?
I want you to get it to the place that I envision. I want it to become more familiar for me. I want you
I
to
didn't buy that.
shift to within my
Yeah.
spotlight here. Shift it into my regime. That's usually the ask.
Yeah.
Usually. That's they're coming along the ride, for the ride, for the to whatever that destabilization where it brings us, and that's when I say it is like this can
It's a
get
rapids. It's not a
dangerous.
roller coaster, right? It's
That's
like
it.
there's no
We're not
person
on
with their hand
rails.
on the brakes, man.
That's right. We're in the hinterlands. It's
um,
and so I know you don't like my Schrodinger's cat uh, uh, analogy with SenseMaker, and if you're going to ask the question, you're going to have to
oh,
identify the. You're gonna have to sort of deal with the answer. It's not quite that. I'm diverting to that for a reason, but I'm losing exactly why that was. It's the I'm asking for change and
yeah.
then realizing that I've been. Do I like how many times have we been asked, bring me change, and then suddenly they realize, shit, I didn't want to be part of the change. I
Yeah.
wanted you to bring the
I
change
don't
to
want you
me.
to change me. I don't want to have to
Right.
change. I would like everyone else to change around me. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. Yeah, I mean, there's
Right.
also, I mean, as much as like, I feel like I've done my share of railing against words like innovation and strategy. I'm over the word system in general these days too. It's like the word design. It's like not worth trying to have fights about like what a system is, whether or not humans draw the boundaries of systems or not, like blah, blah, blah. All of these things are true and not true at the same time. But like, I'm kind of increasingly feeling that way about the word change, because like
Hmm.
even the word change, and we're getting weird here, even the word change only has meaning when it's kind of in contrast to not change, not changing, lack of
Sure.
change, right?
Yeah.
And like, show me literally anything that doesn't change. Now I know, yes, like there's something that's been that thing that's been in a
Yeah.
building that's been around for thousands of years, or like a giant piece of granite that has, been around for, I don't know, a million years. Yeah, I get it. But like in the social sense of the word change, I think there's this, again, I'm in lately I've been meditating a lot on the intransitive versus transitive thing, right? And I had this in one of my older Medium pieces, but I've revisited it because of some other long form writing I'm doing. And I am big on like this lately, because again, to change something else versus when something just changes, when a plant grows versus when the gardener grows a plant, right? And so the transitive is I'm growing a plant, I'm a subject doing something to an object, versus intransitive, the thing is growing because it's just growing. It is just
Mm-hmm.
doing the thing. And anyway, we're just down such a rabbit hole on this that is not relevant. But I just think that lately, I don't even want to talk about change unless you're talking to me about the latter form of change, a thing that is changing. Remove
Mm-hmm.
the subject entirely. Homer yourself into the bushes, and when every there is no single client out there who's going to ask for change and mean that. You don't ask for change if you
Right.
know that change is that intransitive form. It's
Inevitable.
right. So like how you do it, how do you make the switch? How do you help people, not convince them or
Mm-hmm.
help in like the guru sense of the word, but how do you, when it is your job and you make your paycheck and pay your mortgage, how do you help people recognize that the thing that they want to see is not something that they can actually make happen, and yet that thing will happen if they remove themselves as the acting subject? And then you're like, cool, I do actually sound like Ram Dass. This sucks. And then, I got to get paid. So that is the challenge of our time.
That
You
was the
know,
conversation I just had with a whole group of change management folks, where they're frustrated. Why can't we get things to change? And I kept my mouth shut the
change
entire
management
conversation.
is the next frontier we ride into, isn't it,
Yeah,
Kyle? Because I
till I
feel like we've been
finally
having
said, "How do you get
conversations.
things not to change? Like, just if
That's
it's not
probably actually
changing,
the quicker route to the change management or transformation that you want is to get everyone involved in trying to maintain the status quo as much as fucking possible. Boom,
that's
done.
it. That's
Boom, done.
the energy investment. It is the energy is being invested in stabilization. Reducing that energy returns back to the inevitability of change.
I'm just laughing because one of the things that I was thinking of, I wrote a little thing as a reminder early on in this conversation when we were talking about the very opening around record stores, and you were making the point about property, or you may not have said property, but I hear, intellectual property, ownership. You can't like own a song, man. Like, you know what I mean? And talking about the trading of things that weren't a problem until suddenly there was a reason for it to be problematic.
Hit
And
people in the
I
pocketbook.
I almost trotted out the old Le Guin / anarchist gem, and I wrote the little note of it, and then we just moved along. But it's kind of funny to read it now, which you guys have heard this quote, right? I hope is to make a thief, make an owner, to create crime, create laws. I'm looking at my corner of my screen because I actually keep this. I have a little sticky with a couple of my favorite quotes, and it's like been there forever. So I was like, this is funny. I'll have to move this to the front. But that is a very, you mentioned and you joked about the anarchist in me in a lot of this, but
No, I wanted to hear.
yeah.
Not a joke. I wanted to
Well,
hear.
that's right. Well, I mean, we joke, but
Yeah.
in other ways about it. But yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, there's this to me is where so much of anarchism, philosophical anarchism, not just throwing bombs through windows, but like philosophical anarchism is so aligned with anthrocomplexity in that you have to be able to hold many competing perspectives and not force them to, be resolved. And in that same way, when you say a word like democratization, you don't mean democracy in the like modern United States Republic version. You mean
Right.
democracy and like the real core idea of like
Plurality.
every person, liberty, autonomy, some level of responsibility and obligation to each other that is born of your own and not enforced upon you.
Self-organization.
And yes, I mean, I have a whole draft of an article that I'll probably never publish that is like, if you are into complexity, you are an anarchist, whether you like it or not. But there
Please
is a
publish that.
level of, huh?
Please publish that.
I will. I mean, spoiler alert, like as I've told you, two other people have already written that and it's beautiful and I wish people would read it. Graeber has the, you might be an anarchist, and James C. Scott has 2 Cheers for Anarchism. But basically the notion, I mean, and there's plenty of Graeber and Scott fans in the complexity world. What are we doing, people? I was joking with Cameron Talking-Wise about this, so maybe I'll get it out one of these days. But it's not to say I am sort of trying to argue, hey, you're an anarchist. Did you not realize it? You better put on your anarchist shirt and join the club. Like, what are you doing, idiot?
Yeah.
It's not that. It's more to say there is a whole historical discourse and lots of thoughtful contribution to practice from entire seams and threads. This is true for everybody in all places. And one particularly rich seam for that is the world of people who have thought really long and hard about the tension between personal autonomy and responsibility to our fellow humans, the tension between actual freedom, but then what do you do when someone harms somebody else? The notion of freedom, but then property and ownership. What do we have? What? And how you self organize, and the fact that anarchism's like self limiting thing is that everyone's like, well, you can't have that. It only works if everyone's right and it's a utopia. And like, on one hand, no. But on the other hand, that's kind of the idea in an absurdist way, is that you might be aspiring towards something with full acknowledgement that it'll never be perfect, it'll never be complete. And how much of that do we hear in complex spaces, right? So making decisions with partial and incomplete information, aspiring towards having a vector theory of change rather than a vision that we can enact, So anyway, long story short, well too late for that. When you think about the record store example, to me, it's less like, here's my stance as an anarchist on this, and it is much more, it's a really beautiful example of those competing forces. And the part of me that cares deeply about access and liberty in the sense of like autonomy, self-efficacy, those pieces of, I would say equity, but that word's kind of loaded in some different ways. The way that river metaphor of technology going as far back as the printing press and maybe even just language, that process unfolding is largely, I think, in the service of or makes possible deeper and greater forms of access. But with that comes, again, the tension and the responsibility of how we care for each other when we have greater access and freedom. And when we have one of those racing ahead of the other is where we get problems like 2026. But that is what I think the record store as a small microcosm also is a good example of. We kind of let one of them race ahead of the other. And I say let like we had any choice. We observed one of them racing ahead of the other. And the death of the record store was just a good kind of like canary in the coal mine of what I think was coming with a lot of other forms of technology in relation to human community. And we might still be in the wrong ratio of some of those things, but I'm off on a weird ratio metaphor that I'm not prepared to follow. So,
well, that's really fascinating, and because I think about arbitration in that conversation as well, which is, I know the slippery slope is a bad argument, but I understand that's sort of what it is, especially talking to an anarchist. But but what I think when you're talking about those competing components, the record store was a curation. It was not all the records that we could ever want.
It was a wholly different concept.
Just tossed around. There were people there that it was in a particular neighborhood, in a town that had an identity, in a neighborhood that had an identity, owned by somebody that had an idea or a vision for how they were going to do this, bought by somebody that had a relationship with people that were selling these records, and then it was arranged in a particular way in these stores, and then it was people like you and I that went into those stores that populated it, and the way we bought things influenced the behaviors of how the stores were stocked and restocked, and who else showed up at it. So the identity was, I mean, it was shaped in minute by minute by everybody that surrounded it and didn't even know it existed. They were shaping that identity.
Yeah.
So there was an incredible amount of curation that went into every record that ended up there and every conversation that landed there. What the internet has done, or what the world of Spotify has done, is taken most, if not all of that away. Probably hyperbolic to say it's all gone, but it hasn't made it coherent enough that most people I talk to have found enough meaning in it to call it a relationship, a healthy relationship, curated, any of those sort of things. But what's also happened in this, when I think about arbitration, is those platforms like Spotify, like I wouldn't call Bandcamp exploitive, but the ability to build the platforms to just say, come store all of
Yeah.
your IP in these places
Right.
because data storage is cheap and all you're talking about is ones and zeros.
Yeah.
That exploitation is cheap and it allowed for that, and there was nothing to protect anyone from that. There was
Yeah.
nothing. When you're talking about can we put a physical record store in a place and ship physical records to a place and will people come and buy records, there are so many points of friction there. And not that the internet doesn't have
Yeah.
billions of sites that doesn't create its own degree of
Yeah.
friction, but it didn't mean that some other like venture capitalist couldn't come in and say,
Yeah.
yes, let's have a Spotify so that we can stream these things, or an
Yeah.
iHeartRadio or whatever else. And then
Yeah.
now we have, instead of the big five, which became the big four, now you've got like 6 streaming platforms that pay artists nothing and are
Yeah.
loaded with ads and play a bunch of bullshit that people have a hard time resonating with.
Well, I was thinking as you were talking, because what you've just described is like the kind of divorcing or the peeling apart. The fact that record stores made their business model was to make money selling the physical media.
Mm-hmm.
And that so their physical existence from an existential standpoint was always tied to that. Now the ones who survived were able to, evolve,
Yeah.
and change that. But for the ones that didn't, and for most, it was because the thing they were really providing that was of most value to you and I think to many was not the physical media. It was, listening to you talk too, I'm struck by the way that record stores in this sense were a site like the public square or a
It was a
commons
third
or
space.
salons like literary salons, and
Yeah.
there's that. So there it was a site for those kind of gatherings and curated, the sharing that I've alluded to a billion times. So like that,
Yeah.
the site in which that happens and the convening, that happens was really what was meaningful, and yet the ability for that site to exist was, contingent on the business model of the physical media and the selling of the physical media. And then when everything we're describing came along and these things got peeled apart in a pretty violent and not always consensual way, these things are peeled apart. And so what's happened now is, the selling of the physical media goes and lives somewhere else. And now no longer do those sites for that discourse, for the salon, like, public square kind of meeting of minds and sharing of ideas and such, that doesn't exist in the record store form anymore. You can see it in other places. People have tried to recreate it to varying degrees of success in other places, but when it's divorced from a physical, site that then comes along with the costs of a material physical site, it's a little bit harder to reconcile and bring back in that form. And I don't just mean in music, I just mean in any form, any number of forms of communities that exist these days, guys. Think about all the communities that are cropping up, and some of them are paid and some of them are not paid, and they have different levels of formality and such. But there's just something about this that is striking me, because the other thing that I will admit I don't engage much with are those platforms. So I was never really invested in the record store experience because the sites in which I was engaging in those things were other places, and they're still available to me. Similarly with music, I don't really listen to Spotify or any of those.
Same.
I have Spotify, but I only use it if I want to listen to something I don't own, because I own a shit ton of music. And because of
Same.
that, way back, I ripped it all to iTunes. And so I have all of my literal music in my digital library. And these days, when I discover new bands or when bands put out new music, I'm usually discovering it a couple places. Either I'm at shows and I'm talking to people, or bands that I love are talking about it in various places. Or, there are blogs, there are people that are doing, ironically, that curation in the digital place. And so that's what raises my awareness of something. And then I will buy the physical media from the band directly, or from, if I see them live or something. And more often than not, it'll be a record. And they'll also include, either a code, or these days you can just download the shit wherever you want to get it
Yeah.
for free. But I'll pay for the physical media, and then I'll still have the digital, that I add to my library. And so it just strikes me how much you've described what the thing looked like when it was integral. And we have done the opposite. It's like differential versus integral calculus. we have separated out, I don't mind that we've separated the monetary piece of it, but doing that had the downside of now this thing is kind of floating in the ether. It's not tethered to a material space because it's not propped up by material exchange of goods and money. And so now finding the sites for that same kind of, curation and sharing and interaction is a harder, it's a weird equation. And some people didn't even know that that's what they were losing, so they just flocked to Spotify to get their music and then wonder,
Yeah.
why do I feel so weird and lonely and isolated? It's because you lost the thing that came along for the ride when you were forced to be in physical spaces, or not even physical, but in community social spaces to engage with the physical stuff you were trying to get access to. So good job, us humans.
Well, that's kind of it. We shot ourselves in the foot. Like we won't know the things that we were privileged by until they start to drop out from
Full
underneath
circle.
us.
We've just
right?
concluded with the
There it
yes,
is. This
Kyle's
is the cautionary
originally
tale,
opening statement. What the fuck?
right? So, but what's you're making me think. This is a question I never asked before. This is, you reminded me of the venue I used to work at in. I did front of house for a place called Joyous Lake in Woodstock, and there's a few townies, but it's a big tourist spot. A lot of weekenders from the city go up on the bus, and the townies were the couple people that came in and they sat at the bar and they paid for their first drink and then they got the next couple for free because they were just there every night. They were a fixture and they made the bar look like there were people in there, so more people came in. But they didn't keep the doors open. And when the tourists slowed down or when it wasn't the summer anymore, we struggled.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, first of all, I was a poor college kid when I was hanging around all these record stores. I spent every dime I had in all of those record stores for the most part, but I don't think I was keeping the doors open. And the amount of time that we spent in there, I mean, if you charged us by the hour, it probably didn't add up. We didn't pay for the retail by square foot or whatever, profit by square foot. It was the people probably walking in and buying Green Day records and, the stuff that you could get at the mall that probably kept some of it afloat. I'm guessing. Not all of it afloat, but probably contributed to a lot of it because they needed to keep some of that stuff on the shelves. They couldn't just stock, Stockhausen records and can records and have a 30-year, lifespan on the most esoteric stuff. Even in New York City, they couldn't pull that sort of thing off.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that. I think those of us that were going there as a third space were changing our habits so much because we also really liked the tactile experience of owning the record and being a collector and saying, I got the thing and I got the weird pressing of it that had the splattered whatever
red blood
vinyl.
Splatter. The Blood album with the blood spatter buzzsaw cutout shape.
Yeah. Or somebody pressed their hair or their dog's hair into the vinyl itself or whatever, I got one of those. But we weren't, I don't know that we were the ones that were keeping all of that afloat, even though we were the ones that maybe, but I don't know. Yeah. I never asked that question in all this time.
Yeah. I mean, it's not unlike the kind of challenge I think a lot of designers face when they are really trained to think about the user or the consumer. But like when you have a product that has one group is the user, but a different group is paying, and that's just two. You can have that be like 20, various different competing interests, I guess you could say. So I think that sometimes just even not having like the awareness that dynamic exists is part of the challenge. So I don't know. I was going to say briefly, and then we should probably wrap.
Yep.
But in spirit of third spaces, and I was asking myself why have some of the underground sort of show spaces that I've been party to stuck around, and I think this kind of reinforces this general notion because the one particular show space that I helped run in Pittsburgh called the Mr. Roboto Project. Was a collective. I know I've talked about this briefly on here before, but we made a choice as a group that I was not part of the founding group, but it was with the collective we of Roboto ran Roboto as a collective, which is a little bit different than cooperative. You can look it up later, but it meant basically that you had to be a member of the collective if you wanted to book a show. So we didn't have central promoters or anything like that. There were kind of a de facto group of people that did a lot of the organizing of shows. So to be a show promoter, like, kind of did have a kind of cultural meaning, but you could also just have like, I never put on shows and wanted to organize and get bands in, but I did once or twice for special things. I was on the board of directors for this for a long, long time, though. So I ran shows and did a lot of this sort of behind the scenes stuff. And I was at shows multiple times a week for like however many years. And so that was my big third space, see earlier stories.
Yeah.
But basically, Roboto took like a very basic cut. I want to say like the first, I don't even remember anymore, maybe the first 50 or something of what came through the door. We had very, very, very low rent. I don't remember it, but honest to God, I mean, like, very cheap, in a very cheap area of Pittsburgh. And it was like a little storefront. So it all worked because stuff was cheap, which is its own thing. That's not true. But the economics were set up so that the overhead was like as low as possible. And you relied on, again, the self-organizing, but also the commitment and the willingness to be entangled and reliant on each other. So a promoter would book bands. The promoter had to decide what to charge at the door, $5 or whatever. And out of whatever they made at the door, a certain cut of that went to Roboto, and then the rest they gave to the bands, presumably. I mean, we expected them to. There were some shady dealings from time to time. And everybody involved understood that. So those spaces have continued to exist. And that was modeled after Gilman Street and ABC No Rio, right? We didn't invent that. But there's a model there that can work even in these trying post-capitalist, like, poly-crisis times. But that model requires something closer to collectivism, cooperatism, dare she say it, she won't say the A word, rather than trying to find the right business model. And I think at the end of the day, I'll make this other joke. Like, we joke about anarchism, but like most people that you talk to who want to acknowledge the utopian challenges of it, it's like, you're an anarchist in the sheets and a socialist in the streets. Like, that's how I think it ends up being for people. But you can apply that logic, that blend of logic, to even the smallest little endeavors. Your family, organizing a backyard barbecue, this community of neighbors that is trying to get something done at the school or as part of the PTA, or, trying to put on a little event or something for kids, or for the organization that you're part of, that you're trying to like successfully just get something to shift the tiniest little bit. That logic can hold at like almost any scale. I think it just gets scarier and scarier for people when it gets to a certain scale, because it involves so much more obligation and care and commitment to other humans. And that's hard. So I don't know. That's the end of my little soapbox on that.
All right.
Any last words?
I do. I want to invite somebody, reach out to us if you did not grow up in the record store era where this muscle was built, where we got to forage, or the card catalog era, where we built the muscle, and now the muscle is not atrophying yet. We're redirecting the muscle in different places. We've kind of built this. We understand how to navigate. But if you haven't built that muscle, you didn't come from that place. I'm curious as to how you are now doing your foraging, if you're able to. What is there? Are you finding things yourself? Is there satisfaction and meaning in it? And I don't want to make any assumptions. I've heard stories, but I want to have a real. I would love to have a conversation with somebody that. Yeah, please let's talk. We don't even have to record it. I would just love to pick your brain.
Yeah. Find us online. Yeah.
Please.
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it. Sweet. All right.
Well done. This is a good one.